Most people never notice when something important begins. There is no announcement, no press conference, no headline that says, "This is where things changed." Instead, it starts quietly. In meeting rooms, in policy papers, in conversations that never make the news. And only much later, sometimes years later, the effects become visible in places no one expects, like a number on a gas pump. Because by the time a price rises enough for people to feel it, the real story is already far underway. And over the past few years, something subtle has been unfolding between the United States and one of its closest, oldest allies. Not loudly, not dramatically, but methodically, carefully, and in a way that very few people connected to the everyday costs they were beginning to see. For decades, trade between the United States and Canada did not require thought. Oil moved south. Electricity crossed borders. Goods passed through checkpoints as if the line barely existed. Pipelines, railways, highways, and ports were not just infrastructure. They were habits. Habits so deeply established that neither country ever needed to ask a difficult question. What happens if this stops feeling predictable? Because for most of modern history, predictability was the foundation of this relationship. Then something changed. And it did not change overnight. It changed slowly, through policies, tariffs, negotiations, and a new tone in how trade was discussed. A tone that replaced comfort with caution. During the years when tariff disputes escalated between the United States and multiple partners, including China and Canada, trade stopped feeling automatic. It started feeling conditional. Conditional relationships do something powerful to decision makers. They introduce doubt, and doubt introduces planning. Planning for a future where what once felt certain may no longer be. This is where the real story begins, not with prices, not with announcements, but with questions that Canadian planners, energy officials, and policymakers quietly began asking themselves. What if our largest trading partner can use trade as leverage? What if access becomes political? What if the rules change again? These are not emotional questions. They are strategic ones. And strategic questions do not produce dramatic responses. They produce alternatives. Energy sits at the center of this shift. Because energy is not symbolic, it is foundational. It affects transportation, manufacturing, heating, electricity, and inflation. And Canada happens to be one of the largest energy suppliers to the United States. For years, that role felt permanent. But when trade tension grows, permanence starts to feel like vulnerability. Not because Canada wanted distance, but because it could no longer assume stability. And when stability cannot be assumed, diversification begins to look responsible. Diversification does not start with announcements. It starts with feasibility studies, port capacity reviews, infrastructure conversations, long-term export planning. And gradually, a country that had rarely needed to look beyond its southern neighbor began having serious conversations about other options. China, as one of the world's largest energy consumers, naturally entered those conversations. Not as a replacement, but as a possibility. And in trade strategy, possibility is powerful. Because the existence of an alternative changes how a country negotiates, even if that alternative is never fully used. These discussions did not make headlines. They appeared in policy circles, industry reports, and infrastructure planning documents. Over time, references emerged to large-scale resource pathways and economic dialogues that involved long-term Canadian energy access to Asian markets, including China, with figures discussed in the tens of billions across extended timelines. These were not dramatic pivots, they were slow hedges. Hedges against unpredictability. Most people never see this phase. They do not see how trade psychology changes. They do not see how tariff uncertainty alters long-term thinking. They only notice when the effects surface in daily life. Because trade friction does not stay in policy papers. It travels through ports, through pipelines, through supply chains, until eventually it appears somewhere ordinary, like a higher cost, not labeled as trade tension, just felt as an inconvenience. It is important to be precise. Fuel prices are influenced by many factors: global oil markets, seasonal demand, refinery capacity, OPEC production decisions, weather events. Economists are right to warn against oversimplifying. But they also acknowledge something else. Trade uncertainty adds friction to an already sensitive system. And friction always carries cost. Even if it is only part of a larger equation. Several trade analysts have described Canada's increasing attention toward Asian markets as part of a broader global pattern during prolonged tariff tension. Countries begin quietly preparing alternatives, not because they want to leave old partnerships, but because they cannot afford to depend entirely on them. This is not confrontation, it is preparation. Preparation changes behavior long before it changes headlines. Contracts start to look different. Shipping routes are reconsidered. Infrastructure priorities shift. These changes happen slowly, but once they begin, they rarely reverse completely. Because once alternatives exist, they influence every future negotiation. The United States remains Canada's dominant trading partner. That reality has not disappeared, but certainty has. And certainty is what allowed this relationship to function without second thought for decades. When certainty fades, strategy replaces habit. Most people feel trade wars through news stories. Very few realize they can feel them indirectly, gradually, and without understanding why. Because trade disputes do not stay abstract. They move through real systems until they become personal. This is why some analysts suggest that Canada's deeper economic conversations with China are not geopolitical statements. They are economic insurance policies. Insurance against a world where trade relationships can become unpredictable. And insurance policies, even when rarely used, still cost money to build. That cost gets absorbed somewhere. Trade wars are rarely measured by what happens immediately. They are measured by the new habits, routes, and partnerships that form quietly in response. Once those habits exist, they do not disappear when tensions ease. They remain as options. And options change how countries think about each other. A small rise in fuel price can feel local and frustrating, but sometimes it reflects something much larger happening quietly across borders, where countries are not asking how to win a trade dispute. They are asking how to live with one. And in that quiet adjustment, the map of global trade begins to redraw itself. One port, one pipeline, one contract at a time. They did not announce this shift. No Canadian official stood in front of cameras and said the country was reconsidering its long-standing trade instincts. No dramatic statement was made about new directions or new allegiances. Because this was not about allegiance. It was about vulnerability. And vulnerability is something governments rarely discuss publicly. They study it. They calculate it. They quietly design ways around it. For decades, Canada's energy relationship with the United States had a simple logic. Proximity made it efficient. Shared infrastructure made it reliable. Political alignment made it comfortable. But once tariffs and trade rhetoric entered the relationship in a serious way, comfort began to feel like exposure. Because when trade becomes a negotiating tool, dependence begins to look like risk. And when risk appears in a relationship that once felt automatic, planners start asking a different kind of question. What if we need options we never thought we would need? That question does not create conflict. It creates alternatives. Alternatives in shipping routes. Alternatives in export partners. Alternatives in infrastructure planning. And over time, alternatives change behavior. Not immediately, but gradually and with purpose. Energy infrastructure is slow by nature. Pipelines take years. Ports take years. Rail capacity takes years. Which means these decisions are made long before they are visible. By the time people notice their effects, the planning behind them is already complete. This is why observers who follow trade and energy policy closely began noticing something unusual several years into the tariff disputes. Canada was talking more seriously about access to Asian markets than it had in a very long time. Not in dramatic speeches, but in feasibility reports, in policy studies, in investment conversations. China, as the world's largest energy importer, naturally became part of those discussions. Not because Canada was turning away from the United States, but because Canada could no longer assume the United States would always be a friction-free partner. That distinction is subtle, but important. When trade tension enters a relationship, even temporarily, it changes how the future is imagined. Planners no longer ask, how do we grow this partnership? They start asking, how do we protect ourselves if it changes again? That shift in thinking is powerful, because once it happens, it rarely fully reverses. Some reports over recent years have pointed to long-term resource and infrastructure conversations involving Canadian access to Asian markets, including China, often discussed in figures reaching into the tens of billions over time. These are not sudden pivots. They are long-term insurance policies. And insurance policies are not designed to replace something. They are designed to make sure you are not trapped without options. Most people never see this phase of economic strategy. They do not see how trade pressure quietly reshapes priorities. They do not see how uncertainty forces countries to plan for futures they once considered impossible. They only notice when the effects begin to surface in everyday life. Because trade friction does not stay in policy rooms. It moves through contracts, through logistics, through pricing, until it reaches people without explanation. This is where fuel prices re-enter the picture. Not as the beginning of the story, but as a visible outcome of deeper adjustments. Fuel prices are influenced by many factors. But when trade relationships become complicated, inefficiencies creep into a system that depends on smooth flow. And inefficiencies always have a cost, even if that cost is only part of a larger equation. Economists are correct to say that global markets, refinery cycles, and supply decisions play major roles in pricing. But analysts also point out that when a trade relationship becomes politically uncertain, it adds layers of friction to an already sensitive network. Friction that did not exist before. Friction that planners must now account for. And friction changes calculations. It changes contract terms. It changes timelines. It changes risk assessments. Over time, those changes accumulate, not as a dramatic shift, but as a steady, quiet rebalancing. Several trade observers have described Canada's increased attention toward Asian markets as part of a wider pattern seen globally when countries experience prolonged tariff uncertainty. They do not abandon old partners. They prepare alternatives. Because the goal is not to leave. The goal is to avoid being dependent on a relationship that has proven it can become political. Preparation changes posture. A country with options negotiates differently than one without them, even if those options are never fully used. Their mere existence changes the tone of every conversation. And this is what many people miss about trade wars. They are rarely about what happens during the dispute. They are about what happens after, when countries remember how vulnerable they felt, and quietly decide never to feel that way again. The United States remains Canada's largest trading partner by a wide margin. That fact has not changed. But the psychology around that relationship has. Certainty has been replaced by caution. And caution introduces strategy where habit once existed. This is why the story is not about a dramatic Canadian pivot. It is about a quiet Canadian preparation. A preparation that does not require public declarations to matter. Because once the planning begins, it influences every future decision. Most people experience trade wars through headlines. Very few realize they experience them through daily costs, gradually and without understanding why. Because trade tension does not remain abstract. It flows through real systems until it reaches ordinary life. Some analysts describe Canada's deeper economic conversations with China not as a geopolitical statement, but as an economic hedge. A hedge against uncertainty. And hedges, even when never fully activated, still require investment. That investment is absorbed somewhere. Trade wars do not end when tariffs are removed. Their effects linger in the new habits countries develop in response. New routes, new partners, new infrastructure priorities. Once those exist, they do not disappear. They become part of the new landscape. And that landscape affects everything from negotiation posture to pricing structures. Even if most people never see the connection. A change at the pump can feel like a simple frustration, but sometimes it reflects a much larger shift that began quietly years earlier in places most people never look. Where countries are not asking how to win a trade dispute. They are asking how to protect themselves from the next one. And in doing so, they slowly redraw the map of trade, without ever announcing that they have. And this is where the story becomes more revealing. Because the most important part of this shift is not what Canada said, it is what Canada started preparing for. When trade feels stable, countries build infrastructure that assumes continuity. When trade feels uncertain, countries build infrastructure that assumes alternatives. That difference is subtle, but it changes everything. For decades, Canada's energy exports were designed with a simple logic: southbound efficiency. Pipelines, rail networks, refining systems, all optimized for one direction. There was little need to design serious capacity for long-distance export across oceans, because there was no reason to. The United States was close, reliable, and predictable. But once predictability weakens, design priorities begin to change. Observers of Canadian energy policy began noticing more serious conversations about port capacity on the Pacific coast, about rail logistics that could connect inland production to overseas markets, about export flexibility that had not been a priority before. These were not symbolic moves. They were structural ones. And structural decisions reveal long-term thinking. China's role in this story is not dramatic. It is practical. China is the world's largest importer of energy. Any country considering diversification will naturally look at the largest potential customer, not as a statement of alignment, but as a matter of scale. This is what makes the situation interesting to analysts. Canada was not signaling a pivot away from the United States. It was signaling a desire not to be dependent on a single pathway. And that distinction is critical. Because diversification is not about replacement. It is about leverage. Leverage changes negotiations. When one side knows you have alternatives, the tone changes. Conversations become more balanced. Expectations become more cautious. And that shift happens long before any exports actually change direction. This is why trade wars leave longer shadows than many people realize. They change the emotional memory of trade partners. They introduce a memory of uncertainty, and that memory influences decisions for years. By the time everyday people notice higher costs or hear about new trade conversations, the groundwork behind those changes has already been laid. Years earlier, quietly, without headlines. Energy systems are especially sensitive to this because they depend on smooth flow. When political tension enters a system built on smooth flow, inefficiencies begin to appear. And inefficiencies are expensive, even if they are small at first. This is why economists emphasize that fuel prices are influenced by many variables. But analysts add something else to that picture. They note that political friction can add layers of complexity that did not exist before. Complexity that planners must now account for. That complexity shows up in contracts, in insurance costs, in routing decisions, in infrastructure investments designed to reduce risk, all of which eventually influence pricing somewhere along the chain. The average consumer does not see any of this. They see a number change and wonder why. But for those who follow trade and energy policy closely, the connection is clearer. They see how prolonged tariff uncertainty forced countries to rethink relationships they once assumed were stable. They see how planning for alternatives quietly becomes a priority. And they understand that once alternatives are built, they do not disappear when tensions ease. This is not a story of conflict. It is a story of caution. Of a country deciding that it cannot afford to depend entirely on a relationship that has shown it can become unpredictable. And that caution, once embedded into infrastructure planning and trade strategy, reshapes the map of economic relationships for decades. Even if most people never realize when it started. Because by the time the effects become visible in everyday life, The real decisions are long behind us, made quietly, without announcements, in response to a simple but powerful question. What if this happens again?